What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here, and back to review the Season 2 premiere of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, and the only spoiler-free comment I'll make is that whatever your feelings were about Season 1, these 3 new episodes will only confirm what you already feel. And it's almost as if they kept these episodes in a vault for the last 2 years, because I'm seeing absolutely zero evidence of any course correction of any kind. And to some extent, I have to say, I admire watching the world's most shameless hacks, J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, 100% sticking to their guns and their vision for the show. On the other hand, in a year that's already given us Madam Web, the director's cut of Rebel Moon, and The Crow, it's almost like watching Amazon say, "Hey man, hold my beer, because we have one giant turd blossom to rule them all, 3 hours of total soulless drudgery, and we have 5 more episodes to go before it's all over, when hopefully Amazon will finally put the most expensive show in history out of its misery." And in that only a third of viewers even bothered to finish Season 1, it's tough to imagine that this season's going to fare any better. But for the time being, for those of you out there who enjoy listening to me piss and moan about throwing myself on top of a hand grenade to spare my fellow fantasy fans the same experience, I'm happy to share my grievances against the show. But let's start on a positive note. Over the last few days, I reread what limited material there is on the Second Age, and as always, it is an absolutely drool-inducing pleasure reading J.R.R. Tolkien's prose, and I've got my reading copies of The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion right here. And if you're asking why I have reading copies of these books, because if you've got nice hardbound editions, you don't want to take those like in the bathtub or make notes in the margins and that sort of thing. But my current copies, or my reading copies of these books, they are absolutely turning brown from overuse, but they have been well loved and well thumbed over the years. So as always, I'm just going to recommend that people skip the show entirely and focus on J.R.R. Tolkien's books. And I know there's some people out there who will say things like, well, I don't want to read the source material behind a particular show because it might ruin my experience watching the show. And I always feel like you should have the reverse attitude. You should be more concerned about a show ruining your reading experience as opposed to the reverse. But I'm not totally opposed to adaptations of Tolkien. I recently did an over an hour-long video celebrating some of my favorite adaptations in the past in animation, live action, video games, paintings, you name it, and I'll leave a link to that video down in the description below. If you prefer to have an hour-long J.R.R. Tolkien video that's positive as opposed to negative, that's what I'm going to direct you toward. But what's interesting to see is how some of the mainstream critics are starting to turn on the show. Variety posted an absolutely withering review of this show yesterday, and I feel like the grace period where people are willing to give the show the benefit of the doubt, that grace period is drawing to a close. Like at a certain point, you have to either shit or get off the pot, and the show has to deliver something exciting or emotional or just some sort of stimulation of some kind to the intellect, to the imagination. And as I was watching these 3 hours, I was like, this is just mind-numbingly boring. Like, we can talk all day about how it runs kind of roughshod over anything and everything that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote about the Second Age, but that's the least of the show's concerns. Like these, like the writers and directors behind the show, I don't think they should be working on any show, much less a show devoted to adapting the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And of course, there are always those ride or die fans out there who will like anything if you slap the Lord of the Rings logo on it. It's like, the Lord of the Rings is more than just a brand. It's actually a story with depth and detail and complexity. But those people always say, well, if you don't like it, don't watch it. It's like, well, how did that work out for you with the Star Wars The Acolyte? Like, that's not coming back for a second season. Like, at a certain point, IP and brands and franchises need people to watch. These are expensive shows. So maybe rather than like trying to deflect all criticism from the show, maybe accept the fact that people have some legitimate grievances toward this show. But I guess the best retort to people who say, if you don't like it, don't watch it, comes from a little scene from The Two Towers where Samwise says,
"But there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And it's worth fighting for."
I feel like of all the filmmakers and writers and storytellers that have ever lived, if there's one that I'm going to go to bat to for in terms of like trying to articulate what's great about his work, that would be J.R.R. Tolkien. I've been watching cartoons based on his work, reading his books, and watching live action movies based on his work my entire life, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So it's like, I'm here to stay, and anytime someone does anything related to Tolkien, I'm going to talk about it. But as I was rewatching Peter Jackson's original trilogy for The Lord of the Rings a couple weeks ago, what I realized is that the writers and directors behind this show, it seems like they only understand or remember or appreciate the most superficial ingredients of Peter Jackson's approach, but none of the depth of like where those stories come from. Like they like the aesthetics of the way some elves dress with like their hair. Like anyway, we'll get to the elven fashion in a bit. But it's almost like they look at this like this giant saga, and they can understand like 1% of it, and that's what they're using to inform their entire approach to this show. But like what they don't seem to understand is that all that dwarven architecture and all those wonderful languages and that sort of thing, they are based on something. They come from Tolkien, but like there's this weird disconnect where they only understand like. It's a little bit like they're cosplayers who have like read a synopsis of the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, but don't really have a full understanding of it. And oftentimes when the characters are speaking in this, they come across like cosplayers or LARPers who are kind of making up Tolkien-esque dialogue as they go, but it doesn't quite work or come together. And I know there's a small fan base out there where they don't care about the books. They don't even really care about the show. All they want to know is if and when Sauron and Galadriel are going to get it on. And a couple weeks ago, I'd be like, just go watch some porn parodies of The Lord of the Rings. They got you covered. And speaking of porn parodies, that's often what the dialogue sounds like in this show. But I have to say, having now seen the first 3 uneventful episodes for season 2, I might be ready to join those weirdos where all they care about is watching Galadriel and Sauron get it on, because that at least would be something happening. It wouldn't be true to Tolkien, because in Tolkien, nobody has sex ever. Like, if and when a baby emerges, people are like, how did that happen? Like, where do babies come from? Like, he is not interested in the physical act of love at all. I love him. He's an incredible writer. But let's just say, if you're looking for sex, look elsewhere. But when you're watching this show and you're just like, being subjected to one aimless scene after another with all these weird cliffhangers, like there are these scenes where they'll end on these big, in theory, big dramatic notes that are supposed to have all this like importance and weight. But like, I don't care about any of these characters or what they're talking about. And it's almost like they're keeping secrets from the audience about what they're talking about and why it might be important. Anyway, there are all these weird pregnant pauses that seem to signify nothing. So long story short, I would take this show turning into a porn parody where Galadriel and Sauron ride off into the sunset and just practice black magic while making love. Like, at least that would give us something to talk about. The big problem with this show is that it's just so goddamn boring and uneventful. So if you're still with me and you're concerned about spoilers, this is my last spoiler warning, bail out now. But when trying to diagnose all the different problems of the Lord of the Rings of Power, I always describe it as like, imagine being in the back of an ambulance and you're trying to save somebody's life, but they've got like 10 different life-threatening illnesses and injuries all at the same time. You're like, oh my God, like, I don't even know where to start. Sometimes it's easier to try to figure out, like, what did the show get right? And the honest answer is, like, nothing. Like, this is the definition of the dark side of, like, intellectual property mining, franchise extensions, and as I always say, like, all the hundreds of millions that were spent in securing the rights basically just to the appendices of the Lord of the Rings, all that money would have been better spent just hiring, like, an army of 100 different writers and like, basically give them all the chance to say, look, try to invent your own fantasy series from scratch, and the best one will adapt into a show. But the rest, because we're Amazon, will publish as books. Like, that would have been a better use of all that money. And who knows, there might have been some brilliant new idea that could have emerged from that process. But that's not what they did. To put it mildly, J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, they don't have an original bone in their body. And their staff of writers and directors, they're not much better. And I don't want to spend this whole video calling out people by name, but if you want to look up the writers and directors of this show, their names are all out there. And yeah, avoid their work like the plague in the future, because it's tough not to feel embarrassed on their behalf while watching the show. I mean, you've got this enormous cast of interchangeably bland characters, many characters whom I just outright despise, but they're all spouting this kind of stiff wooden dialogue. And what gets so humiliating about the approach to the show is how they're always like straining for this, like this, what they think sounds like the poetry of J.R.R. Tolkien's prose, but they can't quite recreate it. So what they'll do, they'll take a line of dialogue from Peter Jackson's adaptation of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and they'll change like one or two words, and they'll repurpose it and put it in another character's mouth. I'm like, no, those lines belong to another story. You decided to adapt the Second Age. Live with it. And the truth is, there's not a lot written about the Second Age. However, what we do have is pretty incredible. Like what Tolkien wrote about the Second Age concerns the rise and the inevitable fall of Numenor, the forging of the Rings of Power and the subsequent war in Eregion as a result, and then ultimately the last alliance of elves and men as they decide to take down Sauron once and for all, leading to what we see at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, Peter Jackson's film, where you see the end of the Second Age when Isildur cuts the ring from Sauron's hand. But that's enough material where you could have like one or two cool feature films or maybe one or two cool seasons of television What there's not enough material for is like 5 bloated seasons of television where they invent all these new subplots and all these new characters. And that's where these writers consistently get into quicksand, trying to think of things for these characters to say and or do just to fill the time. And that's what so much of this show just feels like: padding, like filler, like everything involving the Stranger and Nori and Poppy. Like, you can just ignore all that. Like, it's all made up from nothing. Like, it's all complete and total bullshit. And so anytime those scenes begin, I'm like, well, like, Nori and Poppy shouldn't even be in this fucking show, so take those stupid fruits and vegetables out of your hair, go take a bath, and go act in another show. Or the Stranger, a.k.a. Gandalf, who they can't call Gandalf because I don't think they even have the rights to the name of that character, but he's fucking Gandalf. But that character didn't even arrive in Middle-earth until about halfway through the Third Age, and the reason he arrived, along with his 4 other fellow wizards, was when Sauron was beginning to rise again in the Third Age, and he was just like a shadow in Mirkwood. These 5 wizards came from over the sea. They're basically like the last little bit of help that the Valar were willing to offer to Middle-earth for the dark times ahead. And so anytime I'm watching any of these scenes featuring that character, it's tough for me not to just completely be dismissive or just discard them entirely, because I know wherever those stories lead, they're leading to nowhere because this character doesn't even belong in the story. But it's what I've come to realize is that, like, J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, the way they look at this show, they think, well, every story set in Middle-earth needs to have the same tropes or the same ingredients. So you can't have a story without a wizard and a hobbit sidekick. And so that's why they've put those characters in. It's like, no, like, that's a story for the Third Age from the War of the Ring. And I'll confess to having some morbid curiosity as to which wizard Ciarán Hinds might be playing. I suspect they're going to say that he's an early version of Saruman, which makes absolutely no sense, because in the context of this show, he's got those 3 Eminem, Slim Shady, like, Sauron worshippers working for him. And there was a time where Saruman the White was a good guy. If anything, he was the most powerful good wizard in Middle-earth. So the idea of him being in Middle-earth in the Second Age, basically operating on the same side as some of the villains of the story, makes absolutely no sense. But asking this show to make sense, or asking the plot to be kind of like reconciled with what's to come from the text, that's just an exercise in frustration, and it'll absolutely get you nowhere. I get the sense that the writers are absolutely in panic mode, which is why they're doing things like saying, all right, any recognizable character from anywhere in Tolkien, let's just grab them and drop them in, even if it makes no sense. Like, we have not seen Tom Bombadil yet in this season, but it makes no sense pulling him into this season because he is a character. He only makes sense in the context of that scene where he bumps into Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin in the Fellowship of the Ring. And he doesn't necessarily further the plot, but he is a beloved character. But he makes sense in that scene. Leave him in that scene. He doesn't need to be kind of a guide for the Stranger or Gandalf in the Second Age. It makes no sense. But once again, it's like, you can tell the writers, like, well, he's a recognizable figure. People have always wanted to see him. You know, if you don't count the Soviet adaptation of the Lord of the Rings from the early '90s, where Tom Bombadil did show up. And spoiler alert, they drop in Ents into the season. The Ents don't show up at all in the Second Age. They're not referenced once. Like, let the Ents just be Merry and Pippin with their own little private war against Saruman and Isengard and Orthanc and that sort of thing in the War of the Ring, in the Third Age. But once again, they're in desperation mode, so they will pull in any character if they think it'll help more people watch this piece of shit. Just like in Season 1 when they prematurely introduced the Balrog and Khazad-dûm. And if you want to be a total nerd about the history and that sort of thing, it wasn't until the year 1980 in the Third Age where he was disturbed and awakened and he went on his big rampage. So we're talking about thousands of years in the future in terms of the story, but these writers do not care. They know that people like the Balrog, and they know that the great majority of people watching this show, or potentially the great majority of people watching this show, don't care about the text, don't care about the stories as they're originally written, so they're just going to grab anything they can to try to make this show popular in the short term. So I think I've gotten my initial temper tantrum out of my system. Now I'm going to go line by line through my notes and try to call attention to all the little details that jumped out at me, like the idiotic flashback to Sauron being betrayed by the orcs and crawling away as a little pile of goo. First and foremost, Sauron's so goddamn powerful. The idea of orcs being able to stab him and make him slither off, it just shows how the writers of the show have a fundamental lack of understanding of any of, like, the legendarium or the mythology of Tolkien's lore. But I guess they're trying to depict him as a figure of pity who we can kind of get behind and root for. Sauron's evil. Like, he wants total, complete domination over everything that's ever walked or crawled. We don't need to depict him as a figure of pity. You can make him, charismatic or powerful or seductive, but we don't need to feel pity for him ever. But also, they seem to be trying to do a similar thing with Elrond, where everybody's always like talking down to Elrond in the show and talking about how he's just like a mere herald and like, oh, you're not high enough in our rankings or our society to like hear this news or make these decisions. Elrond is the son of Arendil, and I don't want to get too nerdy about the lore, but if you're the son of Arendil, that's like being the son of Superman and Jesus Christ and Elvis all rolled into one. Because at the end of the first age, when all was lost, Arendil sailed into the west to ask for help from the Valar. The Valar came back, kicked the shit out of Morgoth, and when the dust had settled, they invited all the elves to eventually sail to the Undying Lands once they had grown weary of Middle-earth. And for the men that had fought on their side, they created Numenor, and the Numenorians were given long life, wisdom, etc., and so forth. But without Arendil, all of Middle-earth would have been dominated and destroyed by Morgoth. So his son is a big deal, and that is Elrond. And Elrond and his brother Elros were given a choice. You can either be kind of like true to your elven heritage or your human heritage. They both were half elven. Elrond decided to have long life like an elf, and Elros decided to be the first Numenorian king. He was given like a longer lifespan of a couple hundred years. In any event, I don't want to get too distracted by something like the actual text written by the original author of this world, but long story short, Elrond should always be on equal footing as Galadriel or Gil-galad or Celebrimbor or any of the major elven characters. But one of the strangest creative decisions of Season 2 is how they've depicted the 3 elven rings and how, like, they're basically trying to turn each and every single one of them into something that's, like, people are greedy for or avaricious about, the same way that people will eventually be about the One Ring. But I've got a little paragraph here from the Silmarillion which tells you all you need to know about the 3 elven rings. Now, these were the 3 that had last been made, and they possessed the greatest powers. Narya, Nenya, and Velia, they were named. The rings of fire and water and air, set with ruby and adamant and sapphire. And of all the elven rings, Sauron most desired to possess them. For those who had them in their keeping could ward off the decays of time and postpone the weariness of the world. But Sauron could not discover them, for they were given into the hands of the wise, who concealed them and never again used them openly while Sauron kept the rule and ring. Therefore the 3 remained unsullied, for they were forged by Celebrimbor alone, and the hand of Sauron had never touched them, yet they were also subject to the One. So the only real downside to the 3 elven rings is that while Sauron's wearing the One Ring, which he has not yet made in the show, you're kind of subservient to his influence and his whims. So they just take the rings off, they have a big giant war in Eregion, and that's all going to be covered later in the season. But one of the reasons in the Third Age, which we saw in the Lord of the Rings, that Galadriel, Elrond, and Gandalf are all able to wear those 3 rings in the open is because Sauron doesn't have his ring during the War of the Rings, so they're able to use those rings. In any event, they're trying to turn each of the elven rings in the show into like symbols of malice and greed and that sort of thing, and it's just not true at all to what Tolkien wrote. But getting back to the things that I despise about this show, there is an epidemic of shitty music littered throughout all 3 of these episodes. Whether it's elven singing, dwarven singing, human singing, it's awful. Like, you can tell, like, the writers of the music for the show clearly think that it's like really inspirational and moving. It's about as moving as that Power of One, Power of Two shit from Star Wars The Acolyte, but it's cringe-inducing. I mean, I was humiliated on the writer's behalf that they actually had cooked up that melody and put it into the show, assuming they even used a composer at all, as opposed to like some sort of like, you know, AI to crank out the music. But the music is soulless and hollow. Like, both the music and the dialogue have a similar problem where they're always trying to suggest that there's so much like depth and like grandeur to what they're doing, and it comes across as like so superficial and so hollow. Like with the dialogue, you have all these greeting card moments where somebody will share some proverb that's supposed to communicate some sort of advice or wisdom, and it's like, oh my god, like that sounds like it was made up by a fucking 5-year-old. I'm sorry, if you try to dress up your greeting card observations and then like masquerade them as wisdom, people are going to call you out on it, or at least people who like to do things like read books and that sort of thing. But getting back to my notes from the show, oh, well, here's one of my main grievances. It's completely bewildering to me as to why this show invents so many meaningless subplots and so many meaningless side characters while ignoring major characters that are already there, like ripe for the taking. As I said before, the Second Age is concerned with the rise and the fall of Numenor, the construction of the Rings of Power and the subsequent war, then eventually the last alliance of elves and men. All good stuff, all which involves really interesting characters, but like characters like Elendil get totally sidelined. Like, Elendil is a major character from the Tolkien lore, and there's actually, even though there's very little written about the Second Age, quite a lot written about him and his father and his sons, Isildur and Anarion. But all he does is basically mope around wearing that same shitty armor from season 1 with the man boobs. I mean, that armor looks like you could buy it off a rack in a fucking like drugstore. Like, in spite of it being the most expensive show ever made, why does all the armor look like complete shit? But I guess Elendil has it better than his son Anarion, who has not yet shown up in the show, in spite of being a major character in the story. Like, at the end of the Second Age, there's this giant battle where Elendil, Anarion, and Gil-galad all die while fighting Sauron, and Isildur is the one who cuts the ring from his hand. But Anarion is a major character who helps co-found Gondor. At some point, they're going to have to introduce the character, but they keep rolling out this made-up character, Arianne, the sister to Isildur, who does not exist in the text whatsoever, but she's given a lot of stupid bullshit scenes throughout the first 3 episodes. But as I go through my notes, there's one last detail related to the Stranger and Nori and Poppy, which I have to mention. Even though I said I wasn't going to, basically I'm just going to disregard all those subplots. But there are all these villains, all these bad guys who are running around with these silly-looking masks, but they look like rejects from a bad Star Wars show. Like, take a show like Boba Fett or Obi-Wan Kenobi or The Acolyte and take the most ridiculous characters from those crummy shows and then basically just like cut and paste them out of that into Lord of the Rings. That's what these bad guys look like. But once again, anytime these writers or directors make up anything for this show that from their own imagination, the results are always totally fucking disastrous. Perhaps not as disastrous as the depiction of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and his collaboration with Celebrimbor, but at least that is something from Tolkien's lore that they're trying in their own clumsy way to adapt. Like, if you go back to the source material, like, the rings are made over many, many, many decades, and at the end of all those labors, and after all these rings have been distributed, that's when Sauron finally made the one ring so he could dominate everybody that he'd been handing out all these gifts to. But yeah, they're basically trying to take like 3,500 years of history and compress it into a single weekend so that all these characters from the events of the Second Age can all be more or less in the same storyline. But a strange thing happens where if time and distance don't exist in this show, where the only thing that matters is convenience, well, it makes the whole world feel smaller and less epic. Like, Elendil in this show at one point just basically teleports back to Numenor. Numenor is like way the fuck out in the ocean. They'd be like, oh, I'm going to sail to Africa. Like, how long will that take? I don't know, but a pretty goddamn long time. But the teleportation problem in the show is an ongoing issue. Like, imagine if when Peter Jackson had adapted the Lord of the Rings, when Gandalf told Frodo, like, this ring is bad, we got to do something with the ring. Imagine if he'd just gone into his backyard, teleported to Mount Doom, dropped it in the lava, and teleported back and been back in time for happy hour. It would have made the story feel less consequential. Part of what makes the Lord of the Rings so grand and epic is they kind of walk that fucking ring all the way to Mordor, and it takes months and months and months. It takes the entire story, but in the context of this show, the equivalent of the distance traveled by Frodo in The Lord of the Rings, people like travel across that distance in the blink of an eye repeatedly, anytime, just willy-nilly. But I'm just having a quick glance at my notes for episode 3 to see what else jumped out at me. Oh, well, we've got some more stuff being stolen from Peter Jackson's trilogy. We see Isildur being found by a horse, much like how Aragorn was found by a horse in the Two Towers. They bring in some baby Shelobs, like from Return of the King, just so Isildur can fight some spiders. And there's this ridiculous scene where his horse is fighting off orcs and kicks an orc, which gets impaled on a tree, and then the horse is stomping on spiders. Completely, totally moronic. This is a show for 3-year-old children. But nothing was quite as bad as a moment which actually had me guffawing and laughing out loud. I mean, that's when you know a show's in trouble, when people are starting to laugh at the show's expense. But when Arondir makes his return, he does about 700 flips. Like, he does so many flips in this very brief fight scene. It's like, did he actually remember to fire any arrows or actually like fight anybody? But like, meaningless, superfluous flips and that sort of, like, all that stupid spinny shit, it does not make him seem like more of a badass. It just makes him seem like a spaz or a total moron. Like, but I guess that's where all the money for the show went, is providing the special effects budget so they can do 100 flips to, like, walk through a door. And Arondir's subplot goes from bad to worse when we're expected to feel this deep swell of pity for him as he attends the funeral of Bronwyn. Like, I wish this show would kill off more characters that don't come from the book, because they're all totally worthless and meaningless and bring nothing to the story. But this show, it's constantly giving us scenes that are supposed to have all this emotional weight and all this drama and sadness. But like, I guarantee you 9 out of 10 people watching this show have no memory of Bronwyn from season 1. Like, you need a little refresher just to understand, like, this is a character from the character who had the great idea of leaving a secured position, like in a keep with towers and walls, and going to a wooden village to fight a battle. Like, that's the person who we're supposed to feel sad about after she's died. And her son Theo has these stupid emotional exchanges with Arendir, and I wish an orc would just come along and just tear out Theo's spine. He is my least favorite character in the show. But in that Theo gets rescued by an Ent at the end of this episode, he's probably going to play a similar role to that of Merry and Pippin from the Two Towers, where he's going to get the tree people to do something special. Once again, there's not a single Ent that appears in the Second Age in any of Tolkien's text. They don't belong in the story. But easily the weakest stuff from the season so far is all the palace intrigue we're seeing back in Numenor, where Ar-Pharazôn is basically making his move to try to take control over Numenor, and there's this absolutely bewildering scene where this giant eagle flies and lands in the middle of this big dramatic confrontation where they're screaming about the Palantir and elf friends and all this nonsense. And then somehow Ar-Pharazôn uses the eagle's appearance as basically some sort of symbol that he is the rightful heir, as the better claim to the throne of Numenor. But it almost feels like a scene is missing explaining where this eagle comes from, what it might signify, and why Ar-Pharazôn feels like he can use it to his advantage. Like, we all love the eagles from The Hobbit, and we all love the eagles from The Lord of the Rings, and there we understand why they're helping out. But here, it's like they could have said, oh, well, this is, an emissary from the Valar, from the Undying Lands, come to basically give its seal of approval for this direction that we might be taking. But they offer none of that. They allow the audience to kind of fill in the gaps. But I'm sorry, when you have a show where you have where you're not giving it the benefit of the doubt for anything, they're going to need to explain the appearance of the eagle, at least a little bit. But before I get any more demoralized or bitter or cynical just by thinking about or talking about the show, maybe it's time to wrap up this video, and I'll close with a philosophical question. Which franchise is in the worst shape right now that was once great? Star Wars would be a strong contender. Star Trek would be a strong contender. The Lord of the Rings hurts me most deeply because there is so much great material out there. Once again, you could spend half a day reading all the material that there is out there on the Second Age and have a much better time than watching this show. And we all know how great The Lord of the Rings can be, like the animated version of The Hobbit, or Peter Jackson's live-action trilogy, or all the various paintings out there. Once again, I'll shamelessly plug again my video about all my favorite adaptations. But no matter how great an adaptation might be, there ain't nothing like the real thing, baby. Go back and read some J.R.R. Tolkien, and I think a common through line through all these various franchises that are struggling is you have a situation where charlatans and fakers and imposters, or just outright casual fans, are basically given a lot of leeway and a lot of freedom to destroy things that once were very important to us. And I feel like it's always really tough to find people who are the right storytellers to bring a particular book or franchise back to life, because it's not enough just to be in love with the material. There are a lot of people out there who love Tolkien's books, who would not necessarily be good writers or directors on a show. The pool is very limited, and I feel like if you can't find the right people to bring a show to the screen, well then don't make that show. I guess that would be my advice for Amazon moving forward. Stop making The Lord of the Rings and Rings of Power. Try to develop your own material. In that this show has so many new characters and so many new storylines, clearly the writers are desperate to create their own material. Let them let them go off and make their own shows from scratch, and there'll be a natural aristocracy of talent where those people who are capable of creating good stories and good shows, they will naturally prevail over time. But we need to bring this cultural vandalism to an end, where absolute fakers and frauds are allowed to try to contribute anything new to the stories of J.R.R. Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien is not a shared universe. It's not a sandbox. Make up your own books, make up your own shows, and if the shows are great and if the books are great, well then you will find an audience over time, the same way that J.R.R. Tolkien did. But I think at this point I've said enough. I don't know if I'm going to continue to tackle each and every single episode as they get unveiled. At a minimum, I'll do a Season 2 finale review, but we'll have to wait and see next week just how bad the episode is, if I feel like I have anything new to offer or new to say. If the show gets much worse or much better, you never know, it might get better, then I probably will come back and review Episode 4 this time next week. But for the time being, you have my thanks and gratitude for being patient with me as I basically just whine and piss and moan my way through this video. But, I find the books of J.R.R. Tolkien to be absolutely sacred, and when people fuck them up, then we have to say something. Like Sam said, there's some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. So on that note, I'm going to wrap this sucker up. Hope you enjoyed it. Please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.